I love that, like, really hardcore intro with the rock music. It makes me feel super. Cool. It's great to meet everyone. Thanks so much for taking the time to show up to this session as we start to explore the backend side of the project. Kind of similar to what Daniel was saying, at this point, really everything has been focused around working with local data, kind of dummy data. Whereas now what we're going to do is we're going to set up in an 8-base workspace let me jump over here. There we go. We're going to set up in an 8-base workspace the data model in which we will start persisting and querying data. And then just talk a little bit more about what 8-base is going to be offering you as we continue with the project. Now, if you go to 8base.com and sign up, you will have an 8-base account, free account. And we even kind of did some cool things to our paywall to make it just more powerful for you as you start to explore pairing Vue.js development with an 8-base backend. And essentially, when you jump into the 8-base workspace, the first thing that you're going to want to do is create a new workspace, right? So you go here to the backend tab and you click create a new backend, give it your project a name, select a hosting region. The underlying resources or infrastructure is going to be hosted in an AWS, on AWS. And then just select the free tier for now. The free tier will work for your entire project. Now, just to give you a little idea of what's going on under the hood, when you go ahead and create this workspace, it's going to set up on AWS for you a 3-tier serverless architecture. So that's API Gateway, that's AWS Lambda, and that's Aurora MySQL as the underlying database technology. That's just for you to know. 8-base is going to make sure that you don't have to actually deal with AWS, but it's helpful knowledge. And then there's some peripheral things there too, such as S3 for object storage or OpenID for authentication, API authorization protocol. So each one of these little cards here in your developer home represents a different backend project that you might be working on, or one that's been shared with you. And the Vue.js or the Vue Forge team, was nice enough to share a workspace with me, which is Vue.js Forge official project. And this workspace that I'm jumping into right now is totally from scratch. There's nothing set up in it. It's an empty project. So this talk is going to focus on just the data modeling piece, but we'll kind of highlight some other stuff as we go through. And the first place that we're going to start is here in the data tab, as this is where we can start to actually build our data model. I'm just going to create a sample table and then show you how to import an existing schema, which has already been built because it's an easy thing to do. And then we'll just kind of breeze past some of the tedious steps potentially. So here I'm going to click add table, and that's going to give me a new table. And I'm going to call this table example records, right? So this is a table where I'm storing records called example records. And by default, 8-base is going to be managing for me a global unique ID, right? So not an incrementing integer, which will be the ID of the record. It's going to be managing the create at and update at timestamps. And then also, when you are querying your API, you add an ID token as the header, right? And that is your authentication or authorization credential. And so when you are making authenticated API calls, it's going to store a relationship between the authenticated user and the record as the created by relationship. However, once you create a new table, you go ahead and give it a field. So I'm just going to call this field 1. And all the data types that you're used to working with when working with a MySQL database are available to you here. So strings, dates, numbers, enums, all that type of stuff. Also some enriched types. So for example, like geofields is essentially storing GeoJSON in the database. And there's some really cool things that happen on the API when you do that. Now, I'm just going to say that this is a text field, some validations and whatnot. We'll get into more of those as we go through the project, create that field. And what's important to know is that as you are performing these actions, 8-base is really handling the database migration work for you. So it's generating the migrations and running them against the database. So everything's being updated in real time. And lastly, what I'm going to show you here is it's a relational database. So for example, let's say I wanted to establish a relationship between this table I just created and one of the default tables, which is a users table. I can just drag and drop it over here and then say, is this a many-to-many relationship, a one-to-many relationship, and either direction, a belongs to if there's a mandatory constraint, so on and so forth. I create that, and now what's cool is behind the scenes, 8-base is actually managing all the joins tables and then handling things like where foreign keys are being set. So you don't have to do any of that work. You can just approach it more conceptually, and all that's going to be set up for you. Now, we need to set up the data model for this this app that we're building, right? And if we go to the session notes, cool. Here are the instructions. We are doing boards, comments, labels, tasks, and teams. Now, instead of going through and clicking all that, we're going to import the schema. So Daniel was nice enough to give me a schema file here, which essentially is the definition for that entire schema. It's just a big JSON file. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get the raw JSON file here. And I'm also going to delete this table that I just created, just because we don't need it polluting the workspace. Example records deleted. Cool. So we're back to square one at this point. Now, inside my VS Code here, inside my IDE, I have the entire Vue project here, inside a repo, which has a front-end directory in it, right? So now what I'm going to do is, using the 8-base CLI, is actually create right next to my front-end directory a back-end directory, which will represent the back-end of the project. Now, it's not actually like a local backend. It's really just a directory in which we can write some custom functions, which we'll write one. I think we'll have time in this session, as well as use the command line tool to interface with managing that workspace, performing things such as a schema import. So here, what I'm going to do is, if you run npm install 8-base-CLI, that's going to install the CLI. Install it globally if you want to, locally in your project, totally up to you. And once you do that, you're going to want to run 8-base login. It's a browser login. So once you run it, it's going to open my browser and authenticate me and store a token locally, right? Know, too, that on the login command, you can pass it an API token, which can be generated in the console. So if you're trying to authenticate the command line for like a CI/CD script or an action script in GitHub, you can do that as well. I'm just going to go back here. Cool. And now I'm going to run 8-base init. I'm going to call this front end. And then by default, the functions that get created will be TypeScript. I'm just going to say JavaScript is my syntax. And I'm sure that I want to continue. Yes. Cool. It's going to ask me which workspace I want to connect to. And it is the Vue.js Forge official project. Awesome. Connected to that one. And where are we? Yes. Okay, where did that go? It's always something. 1 second. So here we are. Oh, that makes sense. All right, we're gonna reshuffle this really quickly. Git remote -v. Oh, I copied it. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. CD back. We are going to the Vue Forge project, and that's right here. Okay, I'm gonna rm-rf front end. I'm just gonna reset this up really quickly. Vue School, here's the project. Git clone, awesome. Cool. So now we have an empty directory, and now I'm gonna git clone project into front end. Cool, now I have that there. And now I'm gonna do in 8-base init backend syntax JavaScript and connect to Vue Forge official project. Awesome, now I have backend. It was just, I was in the wrong spot in my command line. So now inside the backend here, I'm going to open it up, and the core file here is 8base.yaml, but let's just go straight into setting up the schema. So I'm going to move into backend here, and what I can do is I can hit this gist again. I can curl, hit the endpoint, and just pipe that into a schema.json file. Awesome. So I just threw all that JSON into a schema.json file, and now we can use this to import it into our workspace. So now I can say, okay, 8-base import help the file. Cool. I can never remember if it's path or file. So f file schema.json. and it's going to default to the workspace, which we authenticated. If we wanted to, we could specify a different workspace ID and import it into that one. But I'm going to run that, and now it's going through the steps of importing that schema. There is a way of adding data to that schema import file. So like if you wanted a default schema with some default dummy data that you import into different projects, you can do that. This one didn't have data in it, and we can actually add some dummy data depending on how we do with time. So this could take a minute or two. And while it does, I'll just share some other fun things with you. So inside the 8base.yaml file, this is very reminiscent of like serverless framework, right? But it's an implementation that we did ourselves at 8base. And really what this is this is just some sample code that gets generated with your project, which shows you the different function invocation methods that you can use when working in 8base. So essentially, you can author a serverless function, which is a JavaScript function, and deploys, what's this? Reading ID of null. Here, I'll just finish what I was saying real quickly. There's 4 different function types. Resolvers, which allow you to extend your GraphQL API. We'll toss you the GraphQL API in a minute. Tasks, which allow you to potentially make reusable functions for other functions or run them on a cron job. Webhooks, which allows you to set up an HTTP endpoint on your workspace for callbacks from third-party systems. And then triggers allow you to run code either before or after a database event, like a create, update, or delete. Good for like validation, complex validations, or triggering workflows in your app. Let me see if this loaded in here. Yeah, it did. So I'm not sure what that error was, but we're good. So that went ahead and imported the entire schema for our project here. So using the same steps that we looked at earlier of creating a table and adding fields to that table and then establishing relationships between our tables, that is all that was done to capture or to create this schema, which was exported into that DSL file that we played with. So for example, we have teams, right? So a team has a name, many users, because this is a multi-tenant app, as well as many boards, right? And then if we go to the boards table, we can see that there's a boards that has a title, an image, an order, all these different things. I'm sure that as we continue developing the application, we'll explore more of the data model. However, what is really important, why you would want to necessarily create your database or your data model here in 8base is because simply by creating the data model, 8base reverse engineers a very, very verbose GraphQL API for you to start interacting with. So every workspace that you create has an endpoint. That endpoint is right here. And you can send, and that's a GraphQL API endpoint. So if I went to my API Explorer, and I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with GraphQL. For those that aren't, essentially what GraphQL is it's an HTTP post request where you submit the query as the body of the post request to an API. So a single endpoint rather than multiple HTTP endpoints or RESTful endpoints. And the query, which I'm about to write, is the exact same query that you would write in any client-side application to fetch or to query or mutate data in your app. So, for example, let's say that I wanted to get a list of boards. 8base has generated for me a boards list query, and let's say I wanted to know how many I had, and for each one in there, I wanted the ID, the title, and when it was last updated. Cool. Right, that would be my query. Now, let's say I also wanted to know all the tasks on it. Instead of having to hit another endpoint, all I can do is open up the relationship and then create one query, which is going to join all that data into a single response. And let me just go for description as well. I think there's a description in here. Yes, there is. Cool. And so now if I run this query, it's going to return nothing because we have no data in our database, and we'll solve that in just a minute. But another thing worth mentioning is that inside here, all the operations such as pagination, grouping aggregation, sorting, filtering, search, it's all kind of pre-enabled in the API. So instead of having to figure out ways of building those features yourself, you can just use the API that allows you to do it. And all the documentation is being auto-generated the same way the API is being auto-generated. So you can jump into a documentation explorer and look at, for example, hey, how do I create boards. So if I said here, board, I can see that I can create boards, create many at one time, delete or destroy them. That's a soft delete versus a hard delete. Delete or destroy by filter. So performing a delete or destroy operation on many records at one time. Restore records that have been soft deleted, update records, as well as update records by filter. So one thing I'm going to do really quickly here, and I'm just going to look at any questions. All right. Is my screen not shared?
Yes, your screen is shared.
Okay. Oh, this is the private chat. Sorry. Jesus. I messed up there. Okay. I'm going to jump back in. How are we doing on time? Just wanted to do a quick time check.
Yeah, I mean, that's okay. So are you, did you share all you had to share?
So the one thing I was going to do is we're going to add some dummy data to it so that we populate the backend. I can do that, or I just didn't know what time we started because the schedule kind of shifted.
Sure, you can do that.
Okay, yeah. We'll do that. So what I'm going to do is first off, I'm going to I'm going to write my mutation in here just so it's easy to see. So I'm going to do board create, and in there, when I want to do a create operation, I need to give the board a title. And so what we can do actually is, you know what, we'll just do it this way. So ID and title is going to be the response, and we're just going to say that the full object of the type, of the input type, is going to be data. And then inside here, we're going to say that data is of type board input create, right? So we have to give it the data type. Cool. So that is going to be our mutation that we have to send, and then we have to, of course, give it a data argument. Now, what we can do is we can actually use or write a custom function inside our server-side project that will help generate this data. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete that because we don't need it. I'm going to delete the source directory so we get rid of all that boilerplate code. And then here, I'm going to run 8base generate a task called add new dummy board. Syntax is JavaScript. Cool. I'm in backend, and that just generated the new task for me, as well as put it inside my my source directory. And here's my handler, which is just a JavaScript function, right? So what I can do now is I can say, okay, well, my mutation is right. And now what's cool is that inside this function, we enrich it for you to where here, Andy, this would be where you get any essentially payload being passed to the function, and different function types have different payloads. However, we give you a authenticated API module on the context. So for example, if I want to make an API call to my workspace, I can say, okay, well, I want to await context. Whoa, let me delete that. Context.api.graphql request. And then here is where I could pass my mutation as well as any variables. Now we need to define those variables. So one little thing that's really cool is you can use faker.js. Nice little thing of making fake dummy data. So I'm going to install that in my project. While that installs, perfect. I'm going to then go here to the hacker module, which allows me to generate hacker phrases. So here what we can just see is make sure this is working by, let me first import this. We can import this into the function. And what's important to note here is that inside these functions, we can use any open source module or, of course, a private NPM package if you maintain one and have credentials for it. So here now I can go back to this module. I'm just going to say that the description equals that. I'm going to comment that out, and now I'm going to console.log the description to make sure that we're getting it. And what's cool is that we can test these functions locally. So right up here in the generated documentation inside it, it says, okay, well, 8base invoke local, add new dummy board, and it has this flag which sends it a mock object. And essentially inside every function, you can have different mock objects which populate the event argument being passed to the function in local, in your local development environment. So here, I'm just going to run that. And we can see that, cool, we're getting that fake description from Faker. So now we know that if we go back to our API, we can start to look at what the data argument is, or what the data is that we need to pass our board create and model that. So we know that it needs a title, so we'll need to create that. And then we know that it needs, for tasks, it can create tasks at the same time it creates the board. And inside those, we could create multiple tasks if we wanted to, which we can do here. And the task is, oh, 1 second, let me just open that. The task needs a title and it needs a description. Title and description. Cool. So that's essentially, we can just copy that and drop this in here as a reference object for how we need to structure this input. So we know that the description will be the phrase, right? So here what we can do is we can say for the constant variables, we will have an object which will have, and we can just use phrase for, we can actually use description for everything if we wanted to, because we're just playing here. Title. And we're just going to say that this is the description. Whoop, there we go. And in the interest of time, maybe we can create one task. Okay. Tasks. Create. There we go. And then here, we're going to give it a title and a description. Here, we'll just use description. We can go back to our Faker module and say that the, here, let's just do this. The board is going to be the adjective. And the title is going to be the verb. We could create, if we wanted to, we could create some cool things here, but there's no need. And so now if we run our console log out our variables, we'll see that we're getting all that data. Cool, we're doing that. And so now if we open that back up, it will interact with our API. So we can submit that to our API. And of course, ooh, what did we get? Board create input. What I would imagine is it expects data, excuse me. So what we're just going to do, it needed the named argument on the object. Now, if we wanted to, of course, we could have had a fancier script that generates a lot more data. That passed. Now, if we go back to our backend, we have our first board in here. Oh, we just created an empty board. So if we go back to our boards, we're now in here. Our board neural was created, has some data, and it has the task generated too, as it created the related task in the same request. So hopefully that gave you some fun ideas of some of the things you'll be able to play with 8-base. I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions and take it as needed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sebastian. It was such an amazing session. And yeah, so we have few questions. So I'll just put them on. Okay, so the first one is, do you have any advice for someone that's familiar with REST APIs to get started with GraphQL?
Yeah. I mean, the best advice is start playing with it. You know, I actually find it to be very, very approachable. I remember when I first started approaching REST APIs, it was a lot more, I felt like conceptually there was a lot more things I had to grasp to understand how they work and the way they are structured, as opposed to when I first started becoming familiar with GraphQL APIs, which was more of just saying, hey, there's one endpoint and you have a query language in which you interact with it. If you jump into 8-base, you know, on one of the free tier accounts and just start playing with the data model, whether or not it's the data model for this project or something you come up with yourself, like I say, that little kind of API Explorer, which is essentially an API playground, is really going to help you start understanding how to interact with the API. Now, the only difference is if you're trying to approach GraphQL from the standpoint of developing a GraphQL server, in 8-Base, you can add custom GraphQL operations to your API, which are the resolver functions. And that will teach you some things. We have good documentation and YouTube videos around how to accomplish that. However, I would go to graphql.org, frankly. I think actually that's the domain, but it's the GraphQL Foundation. And they have some great resources on pointing you in the right direction if you really want to go hardcore and start actually developing a whole GraphQL server with something like Apollo server or from scratch.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, documentation is definitely the best place to start at. So yeah. What are some cool applications that are currently hosted on 8-Base?
Yeah, there's one called tradeblock.us, which we love. Tradeblock is a collectibles marketplace, which started with sneakers, and I think they're already on to their next collectible, but they maybe still be at sneakers. I can't remember. It's been a while since I checked in with them. However, they've grown to a couple 100,000 users at this point. Worldwide application, where essentially people come with their really cool kicks and trade kicks, product for one another, and sometimes with a cash component. And that application is fully built on top of an 8-Base backend. I think it's a React Native front end and a React.js web application as well. But that's a really cool one. We got a bunch of different things that people are building. However, what I would say is that 8-Base really supports a lot of multi-tenant SaaS applications really well, based on a feature of the platform, which is roles and permissions, which really allows you to permission your API, taking into consideration your data model. So there's a lot of cool lessons and learning that you can dive into there. And we do have a lot of different SaaS apps that have been built on top of 8-Base for that reason.
That's awesome. And I think you answered a bit of the next question as well with that, because next question was if you can share something exciting about 8-Base, also apart from data storage and GraphQL APIs.
Yeah, no, for sure. When it comes to 8-Base, 8-Base is solving like kind of 4 main categories for you: database, API, roles and permissions, and then serverless, right? Now, those are all things that you can go and build yourself, or you can find different, call it siloed services to enable. But the way we look at it is, especially if you're a Vue.js developer, you love working with Vue.js. What we can offer you is kind of this pre-configured solution that you can then come in and customize for the project, so that then you have something that's rock solid, easily maintainable, and highly scalable, which we have a lot of use case or examples of that having happened with 8-Base, while you can focus on providing amazing UI UX experiences for your users.
That's awesome. So those were all the questions. I do not see more questions. So thank you so much, Sebastian, once again for this amazing session. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, super cool getting to present to everyone, and good luck with the projects. And if you guys need anything, I'll be in Discord, and you can email me too if you need.
Thank you.